Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Before we begin, let me ask you something. How do you win a war without firing a single shot? During World War II, the United States had battles on beaches, in the air, across oceans. But one of the most decisive battlegrounds was silent, invisible, and buried inside strings of numbers and letters. Germany believed its encrypted messages were unbreakable. Hitler's intelligence services relied on those codes to move spies, money, supplies, and sabotage teams across the Western Hemisphere. But they had overlooked one person, a woman they barely even knew existed. Her name was Elizebeth Smith Friedman, and for more than 25 years she cracked enemy codes for the U.S. government. Long before America even had a formal intelligence agency, she worked against Prohibition-era smugglers, Japanese agents in South America, and eventually the Nazi spy rings that threatened the entire Western Hemisphere. In today's episode, you'll hear the incredible true story of how one woman, armed with nothing but a pencil, intuition, and a mind sharper than any machine, dismantled entire Nazi intelligence networks. She wasn't in the headlines. She wasn't given credit in official wartime reports. In fact, much of her work remained classified for over 70 years. But now the full truth is out, and it's time to tell it. Elizebeth Smith didn't come from a military family, and she never planned on becoming a codebreaker. Born in 1892 in rural Indiana, she grew up on a farm, reading Shakespeare and dreaming of becoming a writer. Her only formal training was in literature and poetry. No mathematics, no engineering, nothing that suggested espionage. But what she did have was an extraordinary talent for patterns, the kind of intuitive sense for structure that most people never develop. That talent caught the attention of George Fabian, a wealthy, eccentric industrialist who believed Shakespeare's plays contained secret messages. It sounds absurd now, but Fabian's obsession unintentionally launched the first real code-breaking laboratory in the United States, known as Riverbank Laboratories. At Riverbank, Elizebeth learned cryptanalysis from scratch. She wasn't trained by the military. She helped invent the methods the military would later use. Riverbank produced the earliest American manuals on breaking ciphers, and Elizebeth co-authored many of them. By World War I, she was already advising U.S. military intelligence, becoming one of the only civilian women trusted with sensitive intercepts. Her work helped secure American troop movements in Europe, but few people knew her name. Riverbank did something else too. It introduced her to a young Army officer named William Friedman, another future giant of U.S. cryptanalysis. Together, the two would eventually lay the foundation for American signals intelligence. But Elizabeth's greatest achievements weren't behind her. They were still decades away, and then the next enemy would be far more dangerous. After World War I, the U.S. government suddenly needed cryptanalysts, but had no official cryptanalytic agency, and so quietly it turned back to the Friedmans. Elizebeth became the go-to expert for decoding communications used by rum-running operations during Prohibition. Smugglers believed their codes were clever. They weren't prepared for Elizabeth. She broke over 12,000 encrypted messages during this period, working for both the Treasury Department and later the Coast Guard. Her intelligence directly led to the arrest of entire smuggling fleets. Courtrooms would watch in silence as Elizabeth walked juries through how she decoded every message by hand. Sometimes embarrassing defense attorneys who thought the little woman couldn't possibly understand international crime. But she did, and she was better at it than anyone. When the Coast Guard eventually created an official cryptanalytic unit, Elizabeth trained the agents, designed the procedures, and built the system from the ground up. She practically was the code-breaking division. Yet even as Prohibition ended in 1933, a far darker challenge was growing abroad. Germany's intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, were operating aggressively across South America, using encrypted radio channels to coordinate espionage networks. And when war finally came, the U.S. turned to the one person who had never failed them. When the United States entered World War II, its cryptanalytic resources were stretched thin. The Army had Signal Intelligence Service. The Navy had OP-20G, but the Western Hemisphere, South America especially, was a blind spot. Nazi Germany saw an opportunity. They built spy rings in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, using commercial radio operators, shipping companies, and diplomatic channels to transmit encrypted messages back to Europe. Their goal wasn't small. They wanted to map Allied shipping routes, sabotage ports, and stir anti-American sentiment. A successful Nazi foothold in Latin America would threaten the entire U.S. coastline. Elizabeth was asked to take charge of a new team within the Coast Guard's Communication Division, a small, underfunded office with outdated equipment and fewer than 30 people. But what they lacked in hardware, they made up for with discipline, rigor, and Elizabeth's uncanny intuition. Soon, encrypted radio messages began flowing in. Pages of random letters, sometimes mixed with numbers or disguised as commercial traffic. The Germans believed their ciphers were unbreakable. Elizabeth disagreed, and with a pencil, a notebook, and decades of expertise, she began peeling back the layers of Nazi communications, one intercept at a time. What she discovered would change the course of the war in the Western Hemisphere. Between 1941 and 1944, Elizabeth Smith Friedman dismantled every major Nazi spy ring in South America. Her team broke more than 4,000 encrypted Nazi messages, most of them sent through an advanced cipher system designed to mimic the complexity of Enigma. One of the most dangerous networks was based in Argentina, led by a German agent known as Sargo. Sargo believed his communications were unreadable. His reports included shipping routes, U.S. troop movements, and instructions from Berlin on how to coordinate sabotage cells. But Elizabeth cracked his system wide open. Her decrypts revealed the names of agents, locations of secret radio transmitters, and even the German code books they were using. Armed with these insights, Allied intelligence moved swiftly. Arrests were made, radio stations were shut down, entire networks collapsed without a single gunshot fired. One message she decrypted exposed a planned Axis operation to sink U.S. supply ships near the Brazilian coast. The U.S. Navy was able to reroute its vessels just in time, potentially saving thousands of lives. And yet, because her work was classified, newspapers credited the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover gladly accepted the praise, but the truth was clear. The person who actually stopped the Nazi infiltration of the Western Hemisphere was Elizabeth Friedman. Her success was so complete that by 1944, German intelligence gave up on operating across Latin America. Their spy system was effectively dead, and they didn't even know who had beaten them. When the war ended, Elizabeth expected, like many, some public recognition, not fame, not celebration, but acknowledgement of the work her team had done. Instead, she watched as agencies fought for credit, often rewriting official reports to make themselves look better. Her contributions remained buried under layers of classification. Hoover's FBI took victory laps for spy rings they never broke. The Army and Navy focused on Enigma and Pacific codes. The Coast Guard's wartime cryptanalytic unit was dissolved and its files sealed away. For decades, historians believed the Nazi South American spy network simply collapsed. No one knew why. Elizabeth didn't complain. She returned to supporting her husband, William, whose own health deteriorated after years of pressure in wartime cryptanalysis. She cared for him, wrote historical studies, and quietly retreated from public life. It wasn't until the early 2000s, more than half a century later, that declassified documents revealed the truth. Elizabeth Smith Friedman had personally done more to defeat Nazi espionage in the Western Hemisphere than any other American codebreaker. Today, her work is recognized by the NSA, by U.S. Coast Guard historians, and by cryptologic scholars around the world. She is now honored not just as a codebreaker, but as a pioneer, the first great woman of American intelligence. So what can we learn from the life of Elizabeth Smith Friedman? First, that intelligence work doesn't always happen in front of cameras or on battlefields. Sometimes the greatest weapons are quiet minds working in silent rooms, solving the puzzles that determine the direction of history. Second, that extraordinary contributions often come from unexpected places. Elizabeth didn't have military credentials. She didn't have advanced technical training, but she had discipline, creativity, and courage. The courage to challenge enemy ciphers when entire agencies doubted they could ever be broken. And finally, her story reminds us of how many heroes of World War II were forgotten simply because their missions were classified. Today, we can finally say her name, and give her the recognition she earned, line by line, message by message, spy ring by spy ring. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden world of Allied code breaking, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who appreciates the forgotten heroes of us. So, there are many more stories waiting to be uncovered, and together, we'll tell them. Thank you for watching,